We'll go ahead and be turning to the book of Romans. We're getting started there with our introduction to the book of Romans here in just a minute. Before we get started, does anybody need the material for Romans? Does anybody want one of the handouts for class this morning? Most of the material will be on the slides as we work through those. But if you have picked up one of the workbooks and want one, or the material for Romans, we've got an outline and questions for each of the 16 chapters, as well as we have an introduction lesson that we're going to go through this morning. If you haven't be turning to the book of Romans. We'll be getting started there in just a second. Before we get into the introduction, I'm going to ask you a question about Romans. There's no right or wrong answer to this question, and that is simply, when you hear the book of Romans, what's the first things that comes to your mind when you hear about Romans?
Paul's faith.
Paul's faith? That's what we think of when we hear about the book of Romans. Power of the gospel?
About everybody has sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, whether Jew or Gentile, all have failed God.
All right, everybody's sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. There are several things that probably come to mind when it comes to the book of Romans. One of the things about the book of Romans is that it is widely considered probably the second most difficult book in the New Testament. Obviously, the most difficult is Revelation. And so it's considered by some to be the second most difficult book in the New Testament. Well, one of the things about Romans, one of the reasons I think it's found difficult is because one of the most abused books in the New Testament is the book of Romans. And so when we come through several passages that will be misused throughout our study of the book of Romans over the next however long it takes us to get through the book.
People have trouble harmonizing James, the book of James, and the book of Romans because of the faith aspect that we're willing to be talking about.
Yes, you're right. That's probably the most common one, is it's used to argue, and we'll talk about that a little bit here in the introduction in a moment, about people trying to harmonize it with James and saying, well, James says you're saved by works, and Romans says you're not. And the failure is to recognize not just the faith aspect of Romans, but what works are being talked about. Sometimes there's talks about works, and there's talking about works as in we're not good enough to earn our salvation where we were just so great. Sometimes it talks about works, and this is what Romans does, and we'll see as we go through, and it's talking about keeping the old law, which in order for one to be justified by the old law, they had to keep it perfectly. And so those are some of the things versus good works, like Ephesians chapter 2 would talk about in verse 10, after saying you're not saved by works. And James will talk about the works that are necessary for one to be saved as well. Yes?
I'll hold my thought right now.
Okay. So that's one of the things that probably comes to mind when we come and think about the book of Romans. What we want to do this morning is give some introductory material to the book, sort of give us some background information before we get into Romans chapter 1. We may get into Romans 1 this morning. We probably, if we get there, won't get extremely far. We may cover the first 7 verses. It's just some introductory verses where Paul's introducing some things. There's a couple of important things to see in that text in 1 through 7 by way of application for us. But we'll move through 1 through 7 a little bit quicker, so we may get to 1 through 7 this morning after the introduction. The book of Romans is written by Paul. Verse 1, Paul, a servant of Christ Jesus, called to be an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God. It was probably taking place of a visit. He wanted to come to them. We'll see this later on in chapter 1. He wanted to come to them, but was unable. He does eventually make it to Rome. When?
As a prisoner.
As a prisoner. That's what we just saw when we concluded the book of Acts. So this is probably taking place in a visit. It was dictated to Tertius, chapter 16 and in verse 22. In chapter 16 and in verse 22, it would point out pages will quit sticking together. Tertius, who wrote this letter, greet you in the Lord. So Paul's the writer of the epistle, right? Paul's the inspired writer, but Tertius is the one recording it down for Paul, writing it, actually physically writing it down. He's dictating, the letter's dictated when he writes it down. Time frame of the book of Romans is fall of 57 to probably the spring of 58 AD, which brings us to the next point. It's probably written at Corinth. We'll give some evidence of that here in a moment. But it's probably written in Corinth. That's one of the things that can help us kind of date the book, along with some other things in dating the books. It's not an exact science. No, when you see a date, you'll see a bunch of, it may be 60 to 65 or something. There's no, Paul didn't start out in the year 57, or in the fall of the year 57, or something like that. So it's usually some historical documentation, some information given, and all sorts of things, and fitting with the journey in Acts. And we'll give some more evidence of that here in a second. As to the time frame, is because Paul seems to be at Corinth at this time. Acts chapter 20. Paul spends a great deal of time in Corinth. That should not be chapter 20. Let's see here. He just spent some time actually in chapter 20 in Corinth. So yes, he passes through some of the areas and has spent some time there. Phoebe's mentioned in chapter 16 and in verse 1. She's from Cenchrea. It's about 7 or 8 miles away, and was apparently the messenger of this letter. So she's from Cenchrea. She seems to be the one that actually hand-delivered it, this letter to those at Rome. And she's from a city just outside of Corinth by about 7 or 8 miles. And then Romans 16:23 mentions a few characters. Gaius is mentioned, and according to 1 Corinthians 1 and in verse 14, Gaius is from Corinth. Then there talks about a man by the name of Erastus. He mentioned in 2 Timothy 4:20. And it talks about being the treasurer of the city. The city under reference is probably Corinth. Now at the end of the day, whether he wrote it from Corinth or not is not the most important factor in helping us determine. But I do think, being that it was likely written in Corinth, can help us appreciate some of the text. For example, what are we going to see at the end of chapter 1, beginning verse 18? And going through the end of the chapter. What's Paul talking about there? At the end of chapter 1. They're facing the wrath of God. And he gives evidence of several things they've done. And as he comes at the end of the text, in chapter 1, he starts giving some of a specific list. They exchanged that which was natural for that which was unnatural. We're talking about homosexual relations in chapter 1. He talks about them being given to a bunch of other things later on in a sort of a laundry list of sins, if you will. Evil, covetousness, malice, so on and so forth. And he gives a list of a lot of things that has been done by the Gentile world. Just think, though, about Paul when he's writing this. If he's in the city of Corinth, not only is Paul writing saying, here's the thing the Gentile world is engaged in, he can probably look out the window and see it. We're very familiar with 1 Corinthians chapter 6, 9 through 10. And here's, the unrighteous will not inherit the kingdom of God. And it gives a list of sins. And then it says in verse 11, and such were some of you. So that's what the city of Corinth was. And so Paul is probably able to look out his window as he's writing the list of Romans chapter 1 and seeing people that either are engaging in sin or it's known that they are engaging in these kinds of sins. Those things, it didn't seem like things were kept. As immoral as Corinth was, apparently things weren't kept too secret, because in chapter 5 of 1 Corinthians, it was known about the man who had his father's wife. So it would have been known about a lot of these things that were being done in the area. And so Paul probably could have looked out the window and seen a lot of these being done as he wrote that list of Romans chapter 1. Now the theme of Romans, and this is something important to understand. The theme is found in the key verses 16 and 17. The theme is the righteous. Your translation may say the just. Better translation there is the word righteous, but the righteous shall live by faith. That's verse 17. probably one of the more familiar passages to us in the book of Romans. Now, if you just picked up a workbook this morning and you haven't answered the question yet for chapter 1, I'm fixing to give you the answer to one of those right now. So if you want to fill it out, then when I get to that question probably Wednesday, you'll already have the answer. Romans chapter 1 and in verse 17 is a quotation of Habakkuk chapter 2 and in verse 4. It was several months ago, we went through the letter, or the prophet Habakkuk sometime back, and as we went through Habakkuk, we came across this verse in Habakkuk chapter 2. If you want to look there, keep a marker at Romans, or finger at Romans. We're coming back. This is a quotation that happens several times. Habakkuk chapter 2, this is the passage that you'll often see quoted a few times in the New Testament. Behold, his soul is puffed up, it is not upright within him. That's not the part we often see quoted, it's the second half. But the righteous shall live by his faith. Consider the historical context of the original passage in Habakkuk chapter 2. Habakkuk has been questioning how long God's going to allow the people to continue in sin, how long God's going to allow this wickedness to go on. And God says, I'm going to punish them, but you're not going to like how I'm going to do it. Habakkuk is wondering what, and God tells him it's by the Chaldeans. He says, wait a minute, they're worse than we are. And God points out, and he then points out about how bad these people are and how they're puffed up. And God says, look, puffed up, they're not upright. The heart of the puff, or the soul of the puff, is not upright within himself, but the righteous, that's going to live by faith. In reality, you worry about you and the others that are righteous. Yes, I'm using a wicked nation, but don't worry, I'm going to destroy them too. Yes.
We need to make the distinction between our individual faith and the system of faith. Jude verse 3 said, earnestly contend for the faith. But without faith, it's impossible to please God, for they that come to him must believe that he is. He's the reward of those that diligently seek him. So we need to kind of make that distinction. But if I have a personal faith, then I will strive to live by the faith, and then earnestly contend for the faith. So, I mean, sometimes it gets a little confusing, but yeah, there's two different aspects of faith.
You're right, and like in Ephesians, excuse me, in the book of Ephesians, and I was listening to one faith, that's talking about that system of faith or the gospel. And when we get to Romans chapter 1, 16 and 17 too, we can bear out the principles there. The righteous shall live by faith, his faith evident by the fact that he's living in accordance with the righteousness of God, which is revealed in that gospel, which we'll see. Well, when we get to put that text more in the immediate context of 16 and 17 here later on, but you're right, we needed to draw that distinction between those two. Now, Romans 1 and verse 17, that's the passage we've been talking about. We're looking real quick at the righteous shall live by faith, the use of it in the Scriptures. Another occurrence is in Galatians chapter 3. Here's a question for you. I'll ask you this about Romans, I'll ask you about Galatians. What do you know about Galatians? We're not studying Galatians. What do you know about Galatians?
Well, early on they started going to another gospel, which was not the gospel.
So the people in Galatians started going to another gospel, which was not another. When you go and look through the text, that's part of the problem Paul's dealing with, which is what leads to him having to, in 1 and 2, defend his apostleship. 5 and 6, like he does in a lot of his Galatians, is a practical application. Here's how you live. But 3 and 4 is dealing with how we live by faith. Sometimes the book of Galatians, you may have heard it referred to this way before, some refer to the book of Galatians as a Romans in miniature. There's a lot of parallels between Romans and Galatians you can find, but Galatians is sort of the shortened version in those two middle chapters of what Paul is dealing with here in the first 11 chapters. We'll look at the outline here in a moment, but the first 11 chapters of Romans. So, Galatians chapter 3 and verse 11, as Paul's making the same kind of argumentation he is in the early part of Romans, he says, now it is evident that no one is justified before God by the law, for the righteous shall live by faith. And he quotes from the same passage he quotes from here in Romans chapter 1. There's one other occurrence in the New Testament of it, and that's Hebrews chapter 10. and in verse 38. Hebrews chapter 10 and in verse 38. In a quotation there near the end of the text, he says, "But my righteous one shall live by faith. And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him." And so he quotes, "The righteous shall live by faith." So there's several occurrences of the righteous living by faith in Scriptures. Two specifically direct quotations of Habakkuk chapter 2. Romans 1, the last half of Habakkuk 2:4, Romans 1:17, Galatians 3:11. Something interesting about Romans and Habakkuk is that verse, "The righteous shall live by faith," that is the Habakkuk 2:4 that says that is the key verse of Habakkuk. Romans 1:16 and 17 is the key of Romans, particularly verse 17, and that quotation, "The righteous shall live by faith." So it's actually the key verse in both the prophet that it originally occurs in and in Romans, the first of its quotations, as you're reading from cover to cover in the New Testament.
That's so essential because it transcends all of Christian obedience. The just shall live by faith. You go to the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus said, "If you seek me first, I'll provide all these other things for you." So maybe there's something pulling at me to go in that direction, maybe work overtime or something like that, you know what I mean? And maybe I say, well, I could use those funds, but then I go back in my face and wait, if you seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, all these things will be added to you. So there's so many things that are conditional, you know what I mean? And then, of course, Peter said, we forsook all what's in it for us. Jesus said, anyone who forsook houses, lands, family, whatever, for my sake will receive in this world and the world to come. So all this stuff, unless our faith is an obedient faith, you know what I mean? He says, you love me more than you even do your own life, or your mom, your dad, your brother, sister. So if I do that, I'm not going to feel threatened by physical death to the point that makes me disobey Hebrews 10:25. So this is so fundamental, but so necessary because it transcends all of God's commands and then our obedience to them or justification in our mind for disobedience.
You're right, and bringing back to that point of the justification by faith brought along with obedience is, as we pointed out already, Romans is often misused to argue that one is justified by faith only. One of the most quoted passages to argue that is Romans chapter 5 and in verse 1. That man is justified by faith. Now, he wants to argue that we're not justified by faith. Nobody's going to argue against that, right? The righteous shall live by faith. The question is not whether we're justified by faith or live by faith. It's whether we're justified or live by faith alone. Well, the book of Romans, it's often used to argue the opposite, talks about the obedience of faith on two occasions, and it actually brings up the word obedience a third time. We'll look at that here in a second as well. But obedience of faith. Romans chapter 1 and in verse 5. This is the first occurrence. It's kind of bookends, if you will. Through whom we received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith for the sake of His name among all nations. So Romans, when Paul's introducing it, before he goes into his arguments about justification by faith and not by works of the old law, he says that there is obedience of faith. Now, chapter 16, verse 29, or 26 rather. But has now been disclosed, and through the prophetic writings has been made known to all nations, according to the command of the eternal God, to bring about the obedience of faith. It's interesting in the book, often used to argue, really, that there is no need for obedience, that there are sort of bookends, if you will. It begins and it ends by arguing for obedience of faith. In fact, Paul would point out in Romans chapter 6, in the third occurrence where he talks about obedience, and a passage committed to us there as well. In Romans chapter 6, he's talking about, can we continue in sin that grace may abound? Certainly not. How shall we that died to sin live any longer therein? And he comes down in verse 16, and says, "Do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin which leads to death, or of obedience which leads to righteousness." And so, as we go through the book of Romans, we will be arguing for the justification by faith through grace, but that's not without obedience. Paul had pointed that out. Paul points it out at the beginning. He points it out near the middle, not quite to the middle of the epistle, but near the middle, and he points it out at the end. And so, that's something important to remind ourselves of in the book of Romans, as we're getting into all these other arguments about justification by faith through grace, that we see that as well. Now, the recipients. Who are the recipients of the letter? Well, it's the Church of Rome. Paul, the apostle, talks about setting out to all who are in Rome, verse 7, loved by God and called to be saints. So that's the recipients of this epistle, is the Church of Rome. Now, when we studied Luke and when we studied Acts, one of the things we went over in our introduction, and we reminded ourselves of each week, is an outline of the book that we were studying. I've heard it put this way before. An outline is kind of like a steering wheel. It can give you sort of a handle on the text, if you will. If we read through a text enough, and we come out with an outline, and we can sort of see what the main points of the text are, then it helps us in our interpretation of the text. Because if I know that in this text, after reading it through several times, that this section is talking about justification by faith, this section is talking about this or that, I know that that's what he's dealing with in that immediate context as I'm reading it. So, we follow an outline in each of our chapters as we study, and we're going to have an outline that we follow throughout the book because it helps us see the two main divisions there are to the book of Romans. The first main division is justification by faith through grace. The writings of Paul, we've been looking at so far, so we haven't dealt yet with the writing of Paul in its entirety. The writings of Paul typically, there are a few exceptions, but typically have 2, maybe 3 sections, depending on the letter and its purpose. It's a little bit different when you get to what are often referred to as the pastoral epistles, better referred to as the preacher epistles, where he writes to the young preachers, or the evangelistic epistles. But they follow a little bit different approach, but most of his books follow a 2 or 3 point outline. The first is more his argumentative section, if you will. And that is whatever the issue is that Paul is having to deal with, he deals with in the first half. And then in the second half is what we're going to refer to in this letter, in our outline, as simply an application section. And that is, now that you understand this, you need to live like this. I think Ephesians is a good example of that. My outline of Ephesians is something like this. Blessings in Christ, 1 through 3, and walking worthy, 4 through 6. You've been blessed in Christ, now because of that you walk worthy, 4 through 6. There was one outline, I can't remember off the top of my head, I have it written somewhere, but one outline that I like that one person had, and that was 1 through 3, I bade you Christians, 4 through 6, now act like it. And that's really how Paul's writings break down, and so Romans is no different in that way.
I like where Paul writes like Ephesians, and the people of Colossae, he says, you put off this, but you put this on. And Jesus, I think in his earthly ministry, he talked about a spirit that went out of a man, and he went out, but he came back and found the house swept and clean, and he brought in 7 more spirits that were evil with him. And if I understand that right, that just means the Christian doesn't only get rid of these things, but you have to incorporate these and put these off, but put these things on. And I just think, and like I said, in Jesus' earthly ministry, that's my takeaway. I don't know if that's accurate or not. But it, more or less, if we just put off the wrong, but we leave that void empty, then something's going to go back in.
You're right, and there's some debate as to that text, actual interpretation, but I think you're right. That's the application for us. If we put off the one, we don't put in anything more, And that's why Paul would draw that. Put off the old man, Ephesians chapter 4. Now be imitators of God by Ephesians chapter 5, as well as the end of Ephesians where he mentions other things. And so that's how Paul's writings break down. He makes an argument for whatever the issue is, and then he gives them the application. So, the first 11 chapters, the majority of the book is about justification by faith through grace. Now, we're going to subdivide this down. We're going to show this entire outline each time. When we went through Acts, we showed you sort of our main outline and occasionally reminded us of our sub-points. We're going to come back and remind ourselves of this full outline each time because the subsections further help us understand what about justification is under discussion. So, 1 through 11, justification by faith through grace. That's what he's dealing with and arguing throughout this book. Man's not justified by the old law. He's justified by faith. It's by the grace of God. Now, we'll see that obedience when we turn through the scriptures, as we've already pointed out. But it's about justification by faith through grace. There are 3 subsections to this main section. Number 1, the need for justification. That's 1 through 3. So, another thing we're going to do, we did in Luke, and if you have the material already before you, if you look at Lesson 1, there's a title at the front of Lesson 1. Chapter 1, or Romans 1, Gentiles need, I think it's Gentiles need the Gospel is the title I put on chapter 1. Chapter 2, Jews need it. Chapter 3, all need it. You've heard me talk about that before. Romans 1, sort of your simple math, if you will. Romans 1 plus Romans 2 equals Romans 3. If the Gentiles need it and the Jews need it, everybody needs it. Because who's left if you exclude Jew and non-Jew? So 1 through 3 is the need for justification. Gentiles have sinned, chapter 1, and the Jews have sinned in chapter 2. Since both groups have sinned, that means chapter 3. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, which is why all need justification. So 1 through 3 is the need for justification. 4 through 8, that justification is available to all. So 4 through 8, Paul's going to argue that justification is available to all. You're a Jew or a Gentile, it's available. Slave or free, it's available. He argues in 4 through 8, that justification by faith is available to everyone. The 9 through 11 is the rejection of justification. 9, 10, and 11 is dealing with the rejection the Jews had towards the opportunity to be justified. And they were trying to go back a lot to the old law. They didn't like the Gentiles being saved. And so 9, 10, and 11 is that rejection of the justification by faith through grace that was offered to everyone. It was there for them, but they chose to reject it. That's 9, 10, and 11.
Hey, Mike, you don't seek out the great physician unless you realize you're sick. And that was the biggest problem that Jesus saw when he dealt with the Jewish people. He said, I think it's John 5:46, Moses testified to me. You know, you should have believed because of the writings of Moses. They testified to him. And then they scold Jesus because he ate with tax collectors and harlots and stuff like that. Well, those people had the recognition. The woman came in crying and pushed Jesus' feet and then dried her with her hair. Why did she do that? Because she saw that she needed this justification. The Jewish people already, by and large, thought they were justified, so they wouldn't come to Jesus. They might be healed. That's the thing. We all need to humble ourselves and see that we need, as Isaiah 58 or 59, our sin separated from God. So we need this justification. That's only through obedient faith in Jesus Christ.
You're right, and I think that's why Paul, in his argumentation, in chapter 1, this is not exactly how it's worded, but you could almost imagine that chapter 1, Paul writes here, you Gentiles are living in sin. And then the Jews sort of sit back, laugh, and see, we knew. And Paul goes, now wait a minute, Jews. You sinned too. And that's when he shows that need, and then he shows them, but don't worry, justification is available. Real quick, second section, wrap up our introduction, and then we'll get ready for chapter 1. We're doing on Wednesday. Application section, that's living as a Christian. Now that you've been justified by faith through grace, you need to know how to live from then on. So chapter 12 is how we live in our relationships with one another. Chapter 13, our relationship with the government. There's more than that in these, but this is sort of the broader idea. Chapter 14 and 15 is the relationship between the strong and the weak brother. We're going to talk this morning about our relationship to those that are spiritually weak. We're not talking about spiritually weak. This 14 and 15 is the relationship between the strong and the weak in conscience. The brethren that are weak in conscience in 14 and 15. not weak in terms of their actually being weak, in terms of they have a weak faith. And then 16 is their closing remarks. Now, we'll do chapter 1 on Wednesday. Real quick, it'll be laid out a little bit different. I'm going to have the questions on the board as well, and then there'll be the answers. But I'm going to show you the answers after I ask you the question. I'm not going to give you the answers for it immediately. And then we'll work our way through the text. And then that way, when we come to a question, we can get to it on the board. That may change when we go through Romans. It's a little bit different than I've normally laid it out. Sort of a trial run to see how it is laid out this way. So we'll work through those questions. So if you haven't filled out your questions yet or got a workbook, there's several more copies on the front. If they run out and you need one, let me know. I've got some more printed off already that I've just got a whole bunch of printed in the folders. And then we'll get those to you.